For decades, the Swaggart family wasn't just another name in ministry, they were a global symbol of faith, unity, and spiritual power. Their sermons reached millions, their voices filled homes across the world, and from the outside, they seemed unshakable, a family bound together like an unbreakable wall of strength. But behind the bright lights and global influence, cracks began to form. What looked perfect on the surface was hiding struggles, tensions, and truths the world was never meant to see. Today, we're uncovering the untold story of the Swaggart family, the rise, the fractures, and the shocking realities that challenge everything people thought they knew about this legendary ministry dynasty. At the heart of it all stood Frances Swaggart, the calm, composed, and deeply spiritual matriarch who had been there since the very beginning. She wasn't just the wife of Jimmy Swaggart, she was the backbone of the entire empire. To the world, Frances was discipline and grace personified, the woman who kept the ministry strong, the family united, and the legacy untarnished. She was the glue that held it all together, the quiet force behind the pulpit. But what few realized was that behind this flawless image, subtle shifts were beginning to take place. Inside the walls of their grand ministry, whispers started to spread. The once picture-perfect family was showing signs of strain. Donnie Swaggart, usually calm and respectful, grew distant. Gabriel, once the smiling face of energy, now appeared weary and distracted. Even Jimmy himself, though still preaching, carried a heaviness in his tone, his fire dimmed. On stage, the smiles and harmony remained for the world to see. But behind closed doors, the warmth had given way to tension. The air was thick, the atmosphere colder, and though no one could pinpoint it, yet something within the Swaggart family was beginning to break. There was a growing sense that something wasn't right, but no public debates or loud fights. Sister Frances was involved in every decision, from staff schedules to finances, from sermons to who got to speak, and longtime staff members who had worked with the family for decades were quietly asking each other, "Have you noticed how much control Sister Frances has now?" Without her saying so, nothing moved. And although this had previously provided structure, it was now causing the rest of the family to become silent, distant, and quietly frustrated. Donnie, who had always aimed to emulate his father, was beginning to feel constrained. Gabriel, who held both his father and his grandmother in high regard, felt as though he was a part of something greater than himself. Jimmy appeared divided between his allegiance to the women who supported him for decades and the family members who were now turning away. As he became older and more introspective, slowly but surely, the idyllic picture of the Swaggart family, strong, cohesive, and unbreakable, was beginning to take shape. They continued to stand side by side on stage. However, something profound had changed behind the curtains. In actuality, nobody knew how long they could continue to act as though nothing was wrong. Few people ever witnessed the side of Frances Swaggart that lay beyond her polished appearance and gentle smile. She was the elegant first lady of the ministry, always composed and appropriate in public. However, she had an iron grip on the Swaggart ministry behind closed doors. People sat up straighter as soon as she entered a room. She didn't have to speak louder. Everyone was forced to pay attention by her tone, her gaze, and the gravity of her presence. This was viewed favorably for years. She did everything in her power to maintain order, ensure that everyone stayed on course, and safeguard the family's reputation. However, as time went on, something altered. Frances was in charge of the ministry, not just directing it. She had to be involved in all decisions, no matter how major or minor. Frances made the final decision about everything, including the worship music, the pulpit standards, and the financial management. Employees who attempted to provide novel suggestions were frequently silenced. A few were quietly dismissed. Others just learned to keep quiet. Before making any changes in the church, even her own son, Donnie, needed her consent. Meetings seemed to be more about giving commands than having conversations. The atmosphere in the ministry gradually changed from one of friendliness and warmth to one of tension and fear. In his own church, Donnie started to feel alienated. He was meant to be the heir apparent, the one to continue the family tradition. But rather than taking charge, he was always questioning his choices and whether his mother would approve of them. Gabriel was also burdened. Despite his youth and enthusiasm, he soon understood that even a small deviation from the norm would result in his grandmother's silent disapproval. Her displeasure was also quiet. Silence was colder than this. A glance, a pause, an abrupt change in tone, It was sufficient to remind everyone of the true authority. Many employees started whispering to one another behind the scenes. Some remained faithful to Frances because they thought her guidance had prevented the ministry from collapsing in difficult times. Others, however, had begun to wonder if having too much power in one person's hands was more detrimental than beneficial. Knowing how swiftly resistance was dealt with, they were afraid to speak up. However, they were unable to ignore the mounting family pressure. Ministry was no longer the only focus. It was about pride, power, and control. What had started out as a common goal had devolved into a battleground where only one voice could be heard. And Francis Swaggart was still the owner of that voice for the time being. Respectful, devoted, and dedicated to the ministry his parents founded from the ground up. Donnie Swaggart had always attempted to be the obedient son. As a child, he observed his mother Frances deal with things in a very severe manner, and he thought that was the way it had to be for a long time. Her authority was never questioned by him, not in church, not at home, and not even after he started preaching. However, his internal turmoil worsened as the years passed and his responsibilities increased. He became aware of how limited his actual leadership space was. Frances would always find an excuse to alter his suggestions. She would shut down the ministry if he wanted to bring in fresh voices. She would reject him as needless if he attempted to adjust the schedule or introduce new concepts to the pulpit. Donnie initially tried to speak to her in a gentle manner in the hopes that she would see he wasn't attempting to take control. His only goal was to expand the ministry in a way that appealed to the younger demographic. Frances, however, had a different perspective. She believed that everything she had worked so hard to establish was in danger from any change. So, since Donnie loved his mother but felt stuck, he did what most boys do. He remained silent, but it wasn't a sign of surrender. It was the start of a silent revolt. He began forming discreet relationships within the ministry by surrounding himself with a select group of people who shared his vision, not in an attempt to manipulate others. Using the knowledge he had acquired over the years, he started giving young preachers special mentoring. He would record sermons on his own schedule and provide lessons that he personally influenced while staying late at the church. Messages that occasionally deviated from the Sunday service agenda that Francis had approved. His voice gradually started to reverberate outside the walls Francis had constructed. Donnie had no intention of inciting conflict. He had no intention of harming his mother. However, he felt deep down that he needed to leave her shadow before it was too late. He couldn't be a puppet indefinitely. He loved the ministry because he genuinely believed in its mission, not merely because it was the family tradition. The next generation, including his own son Gabriel, would not know what it meant to lead with independence, vision, and personal conviction if he did not take immediate action. He feared. Donnie's revolt was unique in that it was quiet. He didn't dispute. He didn't engage in combat. He just started to move, deliberately, slowly, and with silent strength. However, even subtle movements might cause the earth beneath a strong throne to tremble. Frances Swaggart was also beginning to sense that something was slipping away from her meticulously regulated surroundings. Gabriel Swaggart grew up in the front row, observing his family. A family that was revered in the hearts of countless, on television screens, and in crowded churches. Being the son of Donnie and the grandson of Jimmy and Frances Swaggart, Gabriel was always aware that his life would be different. He was told he had a mission and a calling at a young age, and he accepted it. He cherished the people, the church, and the sense of belonging to something bigger than himself. However, as he grew older, Gabriel discovered that he was being drawn in two very different directions, both of which were related to his own family. His grandmother Frances, a formidable woman who had led the ministry for many years, was on one side. Gabriel held her in the highest regard. She had been the one to keep things together during storms and a source of stability. However, because she was in charge of everything, Gabriel hardly ever had time to express himself. She asked questions whenever he presented a new notion. She would subtly urge him to adhere to the norm if he welcomed younger worship leaders or proposed changes to the youth ministry. Although Gabriel and she never clashed, he felt increasingly cut off from the ministry he loved with every refusal. Donnie, his father, was on the opposing side and had begun to subtly oppose French rule. Donnie and Gabriel had always had a close relationship that was courteous, but not excessively sentimental. Gabriel could see the anguish in his father's eyes as he made a concerted effort to maintain harmony while gradually advocating for change. However, Even Donnie's quiet defiance came at a price. Long, awkward silences, awkward times in meetings, and tensions at family dinners had all become commonplace. Expected to provide for his father, but yet reporting to his grandma, Gabriel found himself in the middle. Gabriel started to feel the weight of this inner struggle. He believed that someone would be let down no matter what he did. Francis might view his siding with Donnie as treacherous. His father could believe that he was too scared to stand up for what was right if he continued to be faithful to Francis. He began to doubt everything, including his voice, his function, and even his prospects for serving in the ministry. After youth services, he would sit by himself and gaze at the empty benches, questioning whether he had something special to offer or if he was simply another name in a long line. Gabriel was doing well in the eyes of the world. He engaged with the youth, preached with zeal, and proudly wore the Swaggart name. But on the inside, he was disoriented, caught between tradition and change, between love and allegiance. Every choice felt like a tightrope walk. The entire equilibrium might tip over with one misstep. Gabriel asked God to give him clarity during the quiet times, for peace, not for prestige or power, tranquility in his own heart, in the ministry, and in his family. But he knew deep down that calm would always be just out of reach until someone ended the cycle of control, silence, and hidden stress. Francis Swaggart's actions have been unquestioned for years. Respected, feared, and regarded as the quiet mastermind behind the ministry's success, she was its mother. Employees took after her. Even family members were cautious when speaking in front of her, and the church trusted her judgment. However, things started to change as Donnie started taking on a more active leadership position and tensions within the Swaggart family increased. Silent discussions evolved into daring inquiries, and for the first time, attention was drawn to Francis' history. With anxiety rather than admiration, it began with a few files, financial data, old board meeting notes, and confidential memos that had been secretly kept for years. Not maliciously, but in search of answers, Donnie and a few trusted board members had started going through them. They were uneasy about what they discovered. Decisions were frequently taken without adequate discussion. Employees were fired without cause, and significant financial transactions lacked clear record. It presented a picture of someone who had functioned in complete authority without accountability, even though nothing was explicitly unlawful. Donnie was shocked by some of his mother's decisions. Not because they were careless, but rather because they were made in private and without consulting anyone. He was terribly saddened by that. He was reared by the same woman who instilled in him the value of leading an honorable life. He was now revealing a side of her that had been concealed for many years, a side that made decisions not out of prayer but out of power. The group fell into deep stillness when some of these previous decisions were discussed during a meeting held behind closed doors. Although nobody wanted to offend Francis, it was widely acknowledged that the ministry's future could not proceed without first resolving its past. Transparency, not fear or control, must be the foundation of the ministry, Donnie stated in a cool but firm voice. He had no intention of damaging his mother's reputation. To be honest, he was devastated to even mention her name. However, he was aware that the ministry was in pain and that things would only worsen if they ignored the facts. Subtle changes were also noticed by the congregation. Over the years, longtime members have talked about the abrupt departure of well-respected employees. Questions began to fly around. What caused some voices to vanish? Why were new concepts consistently turned down? Above all, who had been responsible for it all? Frances experienced vulnerability for the first time in decades as she heard these murmurs coming from beyond the walls. She had been keeping everything together for years, frequently making difficult choices because no one else would. However, those same decisions were now haunting her like specters she could no longer ignore. She didn't answer in public. She made no effort to defend herself. However, she sensed a silent storm building inside of her that threatened to destroy everything she had worked so hard to achieve. Even though the ministry had already survived a lot of hurricanes, this one wasn't external. It was internal. Donnie Swaggart had spent the majority of his childhood under the influence of two strong people, his mother's guidance and his father's sermons. He had always attempted to be the submissive son, the dignified minister, and the silent mediator between opposing factions. However, something inside of him had altered after years of marginalization and silence. Donnie's self-centered thoughts had stopped. He was considering his son Gabriel's role in the ministry, its future, and the deteriorating family legacy. The moment had arrived for him to take the lead, not as a son. The choice wasn't simple. Donnie still had a great deal of love for his mother, but he was aware that whatever he did would have consequences. But as the board started to feel uneasy and more worries about France's previous choices surfaced, Donnie realized that being silent was no longer an option. The ministry was no longer a place of progress, but of control, and the next generation would inherit a flawed system if no one took action today. Donnie convened a secret meeting with the ministry board one morning. He spoke steadily, yet his eyes were filled with emotion. He refrained from criticizing or attacking his mother. Rather, he spoke candidly about the burden he had carried for years, the barriers that had been erected among the family, and the concern that all the ministry stood for might fall apart if they did nothing now. Then he stated something that nobody had anticipated hearing. Francis would no longer participate in choices about leadership. There was silence in the room. A few of the board members appeared relieved, others appeared terrified. Change seemed unattainable since Francis had reigned with silent authority for so long, but Donnie refused to back down. He clarified that it had nothing to do with disrespect or retaliation. It had to do with repair. The ministry required openness. It required new guidance. Above all, it needed to breathe once more. She didn't yell when Francis was told. She didn't cry. She just looked at her son for a long time before finally nodding. It was impossible to ignore the pain in her eyes. This was more than just a change in leadership. In her opinion, it was like being betrayed. This ministry was her life's work. She had maintained it through personal sacrifice, hardship, and scandals. The son she reared was now removing it from her grasp. However, Francis sensed in his heart that this time was approaching. For some time, the indicators had been present. She had clung as long as she could to Donnie's silent rebellion, to Gabriel's faraway gaze, to the increasing discontent among the populace. She had to let go now. Donnie left that day with a sorrowful heart. He was aware that this was only the start. It would not be an easy day. The church was looking on, the family was split up, and their legacy was in jeopardy. But he felt like a leader for the first time in his life. He had finally found the confidence to speak up for what was right, not because he had assumed authority. The ministry's walls didn't feel the same when Donnie decided to remove Francis from leadership. It felt more like a battlefield than a united front, not just within the Swaggart family, but also among the staff, the congregation, and even devoted supporters. The long-suppressed stress eventually came to the surface. People started taking sides, and soon there was division inside the ministry. The shock and hurt were felt by those who had followed Francis for decades. She was more than just a leader to them. She was the voice that had sustained the ministry through its darkest moments, the defender of tradition, and the calm hand in the midst of chaos. They thought that because of her control, everything had not collapsed. They were afraid that everything would fall apart now that she was gone. Many of these devoted supporters believed Donnie had behaved too brazenly, too abruptly, and without enough regard for the woman who had long held the reins of power. Some, on the other hand, thought Donnie was a welcome change. They felt that a fresh course that promoted development, transformation, and healing was needed. Under French administration, these sympathizers had long felt neglected or suppressed. They felt hopeful that their voices would be heard for the first time, but uncertainty accompanied that hope. Nobody really knew what would happen next, and the transition was too sudden and unfiltered. Even more obvious was the split among the church workers. Meetings started to feel uncomfortable. While some loudly defended their opinions, others remained silent. A few veteran employees discreetly quit because they couldn't bear the emotional burden of having to choose between the past and the future. The difference even started to show in the pulpit. While some lectures alluded to freedom and reform, others had an undercurrent of tradition and allegiance. The message was no longer the focus. It concerned who gave it and what they stood for. The split became apparent to the congregation as well. There was a modest decline in attendance. Once strong and constant, their offerings started to decline. Worried about the direction of the ministry, churchgoers conjectured in small groups and whispered in the corridors. People weren't relying solely on the Swaggart name for direction for the first time in years. They were doubting it. Gabriel was most affected by the pressure. He was young and full of promise, standing between two worlds, one with roots in the past and the other with hopes for the future. They were now paying closer attention to his sermons and analyzing every word he said. Did he support his father? Was his granny the object of his loyalty? Each choice he made came to represent something greater than himself. The burden was oppressive. The storm even affected Jimmy Swaggart, who was now quieter and older. Even though he didn't say much, his loved ones could see the anguish in his eyes. The family he had poured his heart into and the ministry he had constructed himself were now on shaky foundations. He questioned whether the division would last forever or if it was only a season. The ministry has already encountered numerous difficulties, financial tests, public scrutiny, and scandals. However, this was not like the others. This was not an external attack. It was an internal wound, a severe personal rift that jeopardized not just their reputation, but also their mission. One question persisted in the air as Sundays went on and sermons were delivered. Given the disintegration of the Swaggart family, could the Swaggart ministry endure? In the past, the Swaggart name was a representation of fortitude, solidarity, and unshakable faith. Their ministry reached millions of people over decades, giving those who felt spiritually lost direction and hope to others who had lost it. Now, however, the same name was encircled by pained questions, bewilderment, and quiet. There was no denying the harm done to the family. A mother and son were no longer in agreement. A patriarch, once the fearless voice of renewal, now watched the storm with weary eyes as a grandson stood divided between devotion and love. One evening, Donnie sat by himself in his office, surrounded by documents and incomplete designs. Once resonating with vision and promise, the walls now reverberated with uncertainty. He had stood up for what he thought was right. He had bravely emerged from his mother's shadow to take the lead, but he was still plagued by guilt. It had been days since Frances had spoken to him. There was more than just physical separation between them. It was heavy, spiritual, and emotional. Frances sat silently too. It felt silent and unnatural in the house that had formerly been bustling with meetings, ministry activity, and movement. She missed the routine, the sense of direction, and the sensation of mastery. She missed her family more than anything else though. Not all of her choices were regrettable. She thought she had taken the necessary precautions to keep the ministry safe. However, she had somehow lost the ability to trust, let go, and let others take the lead. She now questioned whether her hold had caused more harm than good. Being torn between generations, Gabriel had a hard time fitting in. He cherished both of them. More than everything, he desired healing for his family as well as for the ministry. He felt deep down that forgiveness, open communication, and letting go of pride were essential to the future. However, he was also aware that ancient wounds were difficult to heal. Too much had been kept inside for too long, and too much had been spoken. The ministry continued on outside the family. The services went on. They sang worship hymns. However, something had changed. People sensed that the spirit that had bound them together had been put to the test. Sermons were no longer the only thing the congregation watched. They were praying, waiting, hoping, and keeping an eye on the family. The query hung over them like a cloud. Would there ever be healing for the Swaggars? It would be difficult. Time, honesty, and humility would be necessary for healing. It would require painful apologies, late-night conversations, and a readiness to start over. As a family, not as a company or a brand. And perhaps, just possibly, the legacy wouldn't be lost if that mending could occur. It might come back stronger than before. Love, forgiveness, and grace are the foundations, not dominance or fear. Because ministries may eventually rise and fall, notoriety can wane, but family is what really endures.